Welcome to Google Talks, and today we have the great honor of having some of the world's greatest medievalists here at Google. So I'd like to welcome Simon Keynes, Claire Breay, and Joanna Story, who are going to be talking about the exhibition at the British Library that's still on, called Anglo-Saxon Kingdoms, Art, World, Word, and War. And just a show of hands, how many people have been to see the exhibition?
Wow, pretty good.
Pretty good. Okay, well, I'll turn it over to Claire from the British Library. Claire, thanks.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Well, the Anglo-Saxon Kingdoms exhibition at the British Library is the largest exhibition that there's ever been, covering the whole period of the Anglo-Saxon Kingdoms, from the departure of the Romans right up to the Norman conquest of 1066 and beyond. And it looks at the history and the literature and the art of the Anglo-Saxon Kingdoms, examining the original evidence that survives and bringing together some of the greatest treasures. The impetus for the exhibition was the acquisition in 2012 of this little manuscript, the St. Cuthbert Gospel, in my hand there. And that little book weighs only 162 grams, but it cost us £9 million. And so we had, it's the earliest intact European book, and before its acquisition it was the most important English medieval manuscript that was still in private hands, I think. And we wanted to sort of mark that acquisition by doing something really on a large scale about the Anglo-Saxon Kingdoms. The exhibition has 180 objects in it. 80 of those come from the library's own outstanding collection of Anglo-Saxon manuscripts. You can see one of the most famous here, the Lindisfarne Gospels, made around 700. So 80 of the objects come from the library's own collection, and 100 are loans. The exhibition, I think, has been popular for many reasons, but I think one of the sources of its success is that it looks at the beginnings and the foundation of so many things. It includes this manuscript, which isn't actually an Anglo-Saxon manuscript, dates from the beginning of the 12th century, and it's called the Textus Rufensis, the Book of Rochester. And it is the earliest manuscript that we have of English laws. So it contains the laws of King Ethelbert of Kent, compiled around 600. But it's also really important because it's the earliest extended text that we have that is written in the English language. And the beginnings of the English language and English literature are a theme running right through the exhibition. We also have in the exhibition the first original charter that survives on the sheet it was written on the left here, the Charter of Llothere, which dates from 679, granting land in Thanet, and that is next to here and in the exhibition next to the letter of Waldhere, which is the earliest original letter that survives from Anglo-Saxon England, and this letter is written in Latin. So we have earlier letters, but this one survives on the original piece of parchment it was first written on. And also in the exhibition we have this document in which the scribe didn't waste any of the parchment at all. This is the Fonthill Letter, and its claim to fame is that it is the earliest letter that survives written in the English language. It's a letter to Edward the Elder telling a tale of crime and punishment about a disputed piece of land. There are many very beautiful manuscripts in the exhibition, and this manuscript contains this very famous image of King Athelstan, and it is the first portrait that we have of an English king in a manuscript. There are portraits of kings on coins, but this is the first one in a manuscript, and here King Athelstan is presenting a copy of Bede's Lives of St Cuthbert, the famous Northumbrian Anglo-Saxon saint, and he's presenting this manuscript to the community of St Cuthbert. So as I said, the exhibition has at its heart 80 manuscripts from the library's own collections, but we also have these 100 manuscripts and archaeological objects on loan, and we've borrowed those from 25 lenders. And some of those manuscripts have never been seen in Britain before, including this fantastic gospel book, the Ectonarch Gospels, on loan from Paris, with this wonderful lion of St Mark leaping across the page. This was made around 700. We have Codex Amiatinus, a giant Bible made at the beginning of the 8th century and taken from Northumbria to Italy. It is one of the greatest treasures of Anglo-Saxon England, and it has never been back to England in 1300 years until the day it was delivered for installation in the exhibition. We have this manuscript, not an Anglo-Saxon manuscript. This is the Utrecht Psalter, a book of the Psalms made in the first half of the 9th century on the continent and brought to Canterbury, where it was used as a model for other manuscripts, and has these fantastic cartoon-like strips, illustration of what is going on in the Psalms. This manuscript was in the collection of Sir Robert Cotton, but he lent it to a friend and it made its way to the continent, and it's never been on exhibition in Britain before. And neither has this manuscript, the Vercelli book. This is one of the 4 principal manuscripts of Old English poetry, and we're displaying it open at the poem known as The Dream of the Rood. So it's the dream of the cross, telling the story of the crucifixion from the cross's point of view. And it's been in Italy for nearly 1,000 years at least. And the loan of that manuscript has enabled us to display together for the very first time the 4 principal manuscripts of Old English poetry, which together contain 75% of all the Old English poetry that survives. And it's there second on the left, next to, on the left, the unique manuscript of Beowulf from our own collections. And if you've been to the exhibition, you will have seen that there is a replica of the Ruthwell Cross in the exhibition in this language and literature section. And the Ruthwell Cross on its sides has inscriptions in runes, which are extracts from that poem, The Dream of the Rood. So you see it, you see poetry on the parchment pages, but also on the stone. And right at the end of the exhibition, we have Doomsday Book, the most famous book, I think, in English history. And of course, this isn't an Anglo-Saxon manuscript either. It's written up in 1086, and it's on loan to us from the National Archives. And it's famous as a product of Norman control and efficiency. But actually, Doomsday Book tells us so much that we can't see from any other source about the landscape and the organisation and the wealth of late Anglo-Saxon England. So it's absolutely fantastic and unique evidence for that period. So I'm going to hand over now, after that very brief introduction, to Jo and Simon, who are going to take us through the centuries. They're going to alternate looking at a manuscript and then a charter in turn to take us into more depth about a few of the highlight exhibits. Thanks.
Okay, thanks Claire. Simon, you come here. Right, so I'm going to talk about a manuscript, Simon's going to talk about a charter, and the idea is that we're going to move through the centuries seamlessly. All right, and we've got about 3.5 minutes per item. So if you see me giving him a nudge, it'll be because he's running out of time and vice versa. Okay. For those of you interested in big data, Doomsday Book is big data for Anglo-Saxon England. Seriously, it's extraordinary. Okay, right. Oh, it has started with your one. Right, are you going to start with?
It seems that I'm going to start with the Lothair Charter, which you've just seen. This is the earliest surviving original of an Anglo-Saxon Charter. There are about 1,000 of them that survive from the period 670 to 1066. Of that 1,000, about 100 survive in their original form, and this is the earliest of them. And it's dated 679. It's a charter of Llothere, who was King of Kent. It's granting land in Kent to the Church of Reculver, and it's dated 679. It's dated by a system called the indiction, so it's not actually yet the AD system of dating, Anno Dominici, which we're so familiar with, but we can work out that this was 679. We can also see that it was drawn up at the time of a meeting, and it was produced and used at the meeting, and it's got the attestations of the king here, the signum manus of Llothere king, and then the attestations, the signatures of all of his leading men, and they all have their crosses, and this is the beginning. You'll see 4 or 5 more of these things, but this is where it all starts. Unsealed script, very posh kind of script, like the Codex Amiatinus. So a fine thing.
Oh, right, we seem to have missed one of our slides, never mind. Okay, right, coming on to Codex Amiatinus, this is the book that has been prefigured in what Claire was saying to you. This is, for those of you who've been to the exhibition will confirm, this is a gigantic book. It's at least this big, it takes 3 or 4 people to carry it. It is an extraordinary book for many reasons, one of which is that is its size. It contains well over 1,000 pages, 1,030 pages. So it contains the skins of at least 500 animals, possibly more than that. These sorts of books can tell us an enormous amount about the animal husbandry, the landscape, the way in which monasteries worked in order to produce the natural resources that you need for production of books on a grand scale of this sort. The book is also important because it's the earliest complete Latin Bible. It contains the translation done by St. Jerome in the late 4th century, but it's the best translation of this. So it is the version of the Bible that then provides the sort of stemma, if you like, for understanding the transmission of the Latin Bible through Europe through the Middle Ages. It is important because this book was made in England, in Northumbria, at the monastery where the Venerable Bede was based. It is, if you like, a pastiche of an Italian book of the 6th century. And what it represents is the ability of the Northumbrian scribes in the early 8th century to produce a book that was, to all intents and purposes, a perfect Italian book. And it demonstrated how well the English had absorbed the lessons of the missionaries who had brought Christianity to Anglo-Saxon England from Rome round about 600. Even more amazing, it was one of 3 books of this type that was made at Wearmouth Jarrow, and one was intended for Jarrow, one for Wearmouth, and this one, to go to the Pope. And we know that it was sent to the Pope. We've got an account written at the time of the abbot leaving Wearmouth Jarrow with this book and taking it to Rome. He didn't make it all the way. He died in Burgundy and was buried there. But his men took, the monks of Jarrow took the book on to Rome, where it was received by Pope Gregory II. And there it has stayed. As Claire said, it has not been back to England since it left in 716. When it came back to the British Library for the start of this exhibition, there was more than a few tears in the room, because this is a monument of European, of world culture, and to bring it back to Britain for the first time was very important. What you can probably see if you look at the screen is what you've got on the left-hand side is the dedication page. Now, we have the dedication in its original form in this account from Northumbria in the early 8th century, but you can probably see how it's been altered. Can you see it's written in black ink, and then someone's come in and written in brown? That was somebody in Italy appropriating this book for the Italian monastery. And so all the way through the Middle Ages, it was believed that this was an Italian 6th century book, until somebody spotted the correlation between the dedication inscription in the manuscript and in this text, whereby it was sort of rebrought. We realised that it was in fact a book made in Northumbria in the early 8th century at the monastery of Wearmouth Jarrow when the Venerable Bede was alive.
Right, now we go, we've had one charter from 679. This now is another original charter. We're moving into the period of the Mercian Supremacy, a period in the 8th century when the Mercian kings in the West Midlands were dominant in England. And in this case it's dated 736. You can see that scriptar est haec cartula. It's now using a system of dating with which we are familiar, which was introduced into the country by the venomous Bede himself. And it's again, he's called, he was king of the Mercians, but the scribe in writing that has said, I, Athelbald, by gift of God, king not only of the Mercians, but of all of the kingdoms which go by the general name South English. So the scribe is conscious of that Athelbald is more than a king of the Mercians, and in fact when he gets down to the witness list, he's getting so overexcited by this that he actually calls Athelbald king of Britain, which is obviously a gross exaggeration, but is absolutely, he was you know, that's par for the course. And again in this case you can see that the document has been used in a ceremony, names have been added. The document was written in advance, and some names have been inserted there and added at the bottom there. You can tell that from the different ink. So again, we see what charters themselves can deliver at all stages of Anglo-Saxon England in substantiating what we otherwise learn from the books in general.
And a charter of this sort is written in a script that we call uncial, which is also the script that's used for writing the poshest gospel books in that sort of Roman context. So we can tell something about who the scribes are who are writing the charters as well as the books. Okay, so sticking with the 8th century and moving on into the 9th century as well, this is one of these very, very sort of luscious deluxe gospel books that was written probably in Kent around about the middle years of the 8th century, so around the sort of 750s of that sort of period. And this one is here for two reasons, partly because it is a part of what was clearly a very, very sumptuous book, written with copious amounts of gold and silver, but also some of the other pages in this book are dyed in purple, with all of the resonance of imperial Roman connotations that go with that. And it's possible that those dipped purple pages might also have been imported, perhaps from as far away as Byzantium. So this sort of type of manuscript, you can see here in sort of epigraphic capitals, the beginning of the generation of Christ, the part of the Bible that explains Christ's lineage. The X at the top is part of the name of Christ in Greek, but you can see it with all of these sort of curls and swirls, which are reminiscent of Celtic or Irish style of art as well, being used in this manuscript. This manuscript is also here to take us into the next phase, if you like, of Anglo-Saxon history in the 9th century, because you can probably see top and bottom of this ornate page are little lines of writing in little letters. And this is in fact written in Old English, so in the vernacular, and it records an incident whereby this book was ransomed for 3 bags of gold from heathen invaders, heathen pirates, and we're talking here about Vikings. And this man whose name was Alfred, it's not King Alfred but Ealdorman Alfred, ransomed these books and brought them and gave it to the church at Canterbury in order that Canterbury thereafter might remember himself and his wife and his daughter in their prayers in perpetuity as a sort of thanks for the rescuing of the Word of God in this manuscript. So we've got here in this book an extraordinary 8th century book that was clearly snaffled by the Vikings, not because they could give a monkeys about the content of what it said, but probably because it had an ornate jewelled cover on the front. They may also have realised that they could get some gold for it if there was someone who was prepared to buy it back from them. Interestingly also, you might just be able to notice in the margin the name of Athelred, here is the name of his wife, and here is the name of his daughter along the side. Alfred's name is near the name of Christ. His wife's name here comes alongside the word Mater, so this is in reference to Mary, the Mother of God. And the daughter's name is alongside a section which says in utero habens, holding in her womb. So the placing of the names, of at least of the wife and the daughter, reflects that generation of Christ. It says quite a lot about Alfred's sense of his own importance that he goes alongside the name of Christ. But as they read out this text, if you like, the memory of these three people, these benefactors to the community at Canterbury who saved this book from the Vikings, is sort of hoovered up in the prayers that go with the community every time this book is used and read in that sort of liturgical setting.
Now we go again from the sublime to the ridiculous. This is the back of a charter. It can't get much worse than that. What one has to do is imagine that on the front of this charter there is a very significant text marking the agreement marking the making of an agreement between the Church of Canterbury and the kings of the West Saxons. We're in the early part of the 9th century, and so on the front of the charter there is the text of this thing, and then on the top left that's the Archbishop and the members of his community signing the document, agreeing to hold to it. And it's a crucial turning point. We are moving away from the Mercian Supremacy to the emergence of the West Saxons and their special relationship with the Archbishops of Canterbury we've just been hearing about. The people with the document took the document then to Wilton in Wiltshire, in the Kingdom of the West Saxons, and there it was confirmed by King Egbert and his son, King Athelwulf, and it's attested by Athelwulf and then the bishops of Winchester and Sherborne and then all of the noblemen of the West Saxons. So the West Saxons have endorsed it, and then it's taken after that to a church council, and you can see there that the bishops of the whole country also acknowledge this agreement between Canterbury and Wessex. So that's, in effect, it's 838. It's symbolic of this great turn which establishes the special relationship between Canterbury and Wessex, and then leads to the rise of Wessex in the later 9th century, and to everything else that came thereafter, which we'll see.
Okay, so we're looking at this shift to this shift in the balance of power to the Kingdom of Wessex, and this is where we first really hear of one of the major achievements, if you like, of that West Saxon dynasty. This is a book associated directly with King Alfred himself. King Alfred, who died in 899, one of those very easy dates to remember. Now, Alfred's dynasty, we've seen the 838 Charter, is coming to power against a backdrop of external pressure, particularly from Viking raiders, Scandinavian raiders, who start the process with these sort of hit-and-run raids on the coast, and then gradually you get the build-up of much larger armies that are overwintering and staying for several years campaigning. The West Saxon Kingdom was the last, if you like, the last kingdom standing after the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had been, the dynasties had been taken out by Scandinavian armies. And Alfred is well remembered in history as the West Saxon king who is really responsible for stopping that Viking onslaught and maintaining the power of Wessex and starting to rebuild the power of Wessex. Towards the end of his reign, there comes this period of relative peace and prosperity in Wessex, and Alfred is able to shift his attention to something that he had for always been interested in, which was learning. And he understood that the English kingdoms, he thought that one of the reasons why the English kingdoms had been so badly damaged and so badly targeted by these external raiders was that they were not sufficiently, if you like, sufficiently good Christians in order to be able to, God was punishing them for their lack of faith. But he also understood that there had been such degradation over the years of the ability of the resources in England to learn that he said, we've got to do something radical. What we've got to do is rebuild the sort of Christianity across the kingdom, but there are not enough people anymore who can read and write in Latin. He said, before everything was ransacked and burned, we had the ability we had people all over the place who could read and write in Latin, and people would come to England to learn from us. But now he says there's scarcely anyone south of the Humber who is competent. So he said we must do things differently, and we must do it in English. And this is, if you like, the greatest legacy of King Alfred to our modern day, where he turns English from the vernacular spoken language of the ordinary people into a literary language which is appropriate for use in the church. And this manuscript is where he lays out that manifesto, if you like, of the use of English in place alongside Latin as a language that can be there to reinforce, to re-establish the Christian morals and ethos of the English people. And this is where he lays it out. And this is a manuscript that dates almost certainly to the last decade of the 9th century, where Alfred writes to Bishop Werfurth, laying out this agenda. And it then, what thereafter follows, is a translation into English of the pastoral care which had been composed by Pope Gregory the Great, the Pope who had sent the missionaries to England in round about 600. And whereas Gregory the Great had seen the pastoral care as a handbook for bishops, really Alfred sees the pastoral care translated into English as a handbook for kings, about how to operate and how to be a good king.
Well, that's Alfred the Great at his finest. He had a son and a grandson. The son was called Edward the Elder. The grandson was the person responsible for a magnificent series of charters in the 930s, which represent the first establishment of a kingdom of the English. We're no longer the kingdom of the West Saxons. I thought things have moved forward in the early 10th century, and this is a product of this new kingdom. And you can see at a glance what an extraordinary number of people attend these royal assemblies. This was issued, it's dated incredibly accurately, the 12th of November 931 at Lifton in Devon. There was this council meeting, and the document itself is just a grant of land to a miscellaneous person. But you can see here's the king and all of his bishops. Here are all of the ealdormen, the dukes, the earls of the kingdom, coming from Wessex, coming from Kent, coming from northern England, eastern England. Some have weird names, Þorfath, Hada, Skula. These are all Norse names. These are representatives of the Viking invaders. Then some abbots, and then lots and lots of thanes, of miscellaneous people. And this is typical of diplomas of the 10th century, granting land to individuals, and in this particular case the will of the beneficiary is attached to the bottom edge, and he grants the land to Winchester. And Claire has very kindly lent me the charter, and you can get a sense of what these documents look like in parchment. You can pass this round, and I'm very grateful to her. But it gives you some sense of if you owned that document, you would own the land. You could go to court and just wave the document at the people in the court, and that would the fact that you had the title deed would be enough. Anyway, it's a magnificent document.
Yes, even better in the original. Okay, one of the things I always like about these witness lists, and Simon pointed out this group of Norse names, is you can kind of imagine the committee room, and the Scandinavians are sitting in the corner together. You know, and as they go around and mark off who's there, you've got this little group of Scandinavians sitting in the corner. You know what it's like? Students, they always sit in the same place. I'm sure that's what was going on. Okay, right. So here we come to our poster boy for the exhibition, King Edgar. Now, Edgar ruled from 959 to 975, so we're well into the middle years of the 10th century here. And Edgar really picks up on the legacy of his of Athelstan, who we've just heard about, who is one of the kings to really start to define a kingdom of the English for the first time. And Edgar takes that forward, and he does that in a number of different ways, but one of the things he's most associated with is a wholesale reform of the church, because he sees the church, just like Alfred had done before him, as an essential sort of partner in the running of a medieval kingdom, in the running of his kingdom. And just as he sees the kingdom as a unified whole, so he sees the church as a unified whole as well. So he talks about one church and one kingdom. But he sees that the church needs reform, and it needs reform along the lines of the rule of St. Benedict, the 6th century monk from Italy who produced a rule known as the Benedictine rule. Edgar and his followers decide that this needs to be implemented in Anglo-Saxon England in a more systematic way than had been done before. So under Edgar and his key reformers, people like Athelwold, Bishop Athelwold, Archbishop Dunstan, and Wulfstan of York as well, are reforming important churches through the kingdom. Not all of them, but key churches, including the church at Winchester, the Old Minster at Winchester, which is, if you like, the West Saxon capital. And this book is, in fact, a charter. It's the great charter for the reformed minster at Winchester, but very unusually in the form of a book rather than as one of these single sheet charters. And that's because it's so long, and it goes on for sort of 60 pages, but all written in gold. But at the front of it, you have this portrait of King Edgar donating the charter, you can see it in his hand there, to Christ, who's seen in the mandala above them with St. Peter and Mary on either side of him. Christ shown in that mandala like that, the intersection of two circles, the heavenly sphere and the earthly sphere, Christ in majesty in between. And so just as we had that image of Athelstan that Claire showed us at the beginning, donating a copy of the Life of St. Cuthbert to St. Cuthbert himself, here you have King Edgar presenting the charter for the new minster, the Reformed Church, to Christ himself. And then the text of it follows in the 60-odd pages thereafter.
Right, well, I'm afraid it goes pear-shaped after that, because the Vikings came back in even larger numbers than they'd been here before, and under King Svein Forkbeard and then Svein's son King Canute, and with the English under the impressive rule of King Ethelred the Unready, you can imagine what happened, and the Danes conquered the English in 1016. This is, however, a magnificent charter of King Canute, and it shows how once he became king, in effect, he had nothing to bring himself, and he took over all of the English institutions which had developed. And Athelstan's charter, which we looked at, is in a script known as Square Minuscule. This is in a beautiful script known as Anglo-Caroline Minuscule, which is the ancestor of the script that we all write today. And it's just a grant by the king. Most interestingly, it's also at it's issued at the request of his wife, Queen Alfivu, and that shows how significant it was to him that he married the widow of King Ethelred the Unready, and in this way he was able to ingratiate himself, or he thought he might be able to ingratiate himself so much the more with the English people. It's a stunning document. Again, you can analyse all of the names as Canute, the Archbishop of York, Wulfstan, Alfevu, the Queen, and then several bishops, several abbots. And then here you have one of the chief Scandinavians, Thorkel the Tall, and then here is Godwiner. That's Earl Godwin, the father of Harold, who became king. So you can, this is in 1018, the first year of Canute's main reign, and you can see already we're sort of warnings of what's going to happen good many years later with the Norman conquest.
I mean, another interesting thing to just pick out here, while we've got this one on the screen, is that you can probably see that the script changes to a much sort of, if you like, sort of smaller point size and a different font, to use modern terminology. This is the parcel of land. It's a description of the parcel of land that's being donated in the Charter, and it's in Old English. So the main framework of the Charter is in Latin, but when it switches to describing the actual bit of the land that is to be given, they revert to the vernacular, so that it's absolutely clear to everybody listening precisely where this is. You know, and these charter bounds go so far as to say, you know, you go up to the holly tree at the top of the hill, and then you come down the valley till you get to the stream, and then along and around. And you can imagine this being read aloud in the Old English vernacular, so that everybody in the locality actually really understood the precise boundary of land that was being donated. And one of the extraordinary things about so many of these Anglo-Saxon charters is that we can reconstruct very often these absolute parcels of land that are available, including some that were being given, including some, in fact, for land parcels in London itself. And you can walk the bounds of these charters within the city today. Claire, do you want to come on?
Thank you. So I showed before an image of Doomsday Book, which is near the end of the exhibition, and as I said, Doomsday Book contains this incredible detail covering most of the country, and it reflects the organisation of the country. So and it's organised by the shires, which had emerged in the 10th century. And that organisation of the shires, the counties, their boundaries lasted until local government reorganisation in 1974. So it's a very long-lived legacy of the late Anglo-Saxon period. But Doomsday also shows the wealth that existed in England in the 11th century. And of course it was that wealth and the organisation of the country that made England so attractive to Canute in his conquest of 1016 and to William of Normandy more famously in 1066. So those that organisation of the country is a great legacy, but the other great legacy is the English language itself. And as I said at the beginning, that is something that we've embedded right throughout the exhibition, looking at from the earliest uses of short pieces of English in runic characters inscribed on objects and the Textus Rufensis, that earliest extended text in the English language. We look at the use of English and with Latin as a literary language, but right at the end of the exhibition we have this manuscript which shows the continuity of the English language. And this manuscript is very large, book of the Psalms known as the Eadwine Psalter, on loan to us from Trinity College in Cambridge. And it is one of 3 psalters that are displayed together, and it's displayed with the Utrecht Psalter, which I also showed earlier, which has those cartoon strip-like drawings of those very lively characters from the Psalms. And through the display of these three manuscripts, we're trying to bring out or bring together some of the themes that run right through the exhibition, not just the continuity of the English language, but which I'll come on to in a moment, but the themes of connectedness and contacts between the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and their neighbours in Ireland and continental Europe, because the Utrecht Psalter, as I said, was made on the continent in the 9th century, and it was a manuscript that came to Canterbury, and was a copy was made of it, or it was used as a model there at the beginning of the 11th century for a manuscript in our own collections known as the Harley Psalter, and then this manuscript, the Eadwine Psalter, was produced in the middle of the 12th century. It didn't include all the illustrations, but it does incorporate the three different versions of the Psalms in Latin, whereas only one had been included before, and so that's why it's got these three columns of text. And very interestingly, between the lines of the Latin in the right-hand column, the Psalms have been translated into Anglo-Norman French, reflecting the new reality following the Norman conquest. But between the lines of the middle column of the Psalms in Latin, the Psalms are translated into English, showing the continuity of the English language well into the 12th century. I hope, well, I've seen that several of you have been to the exhibition. I hope that many more of you might have been inspired by looking at these manuscripts and charters today to go. Very sadly for us, it closes on the 19th of February. It is extremely busy, so do advise you to book ahead if you'd like to go. But it has been an absolutely incredible experience working on the exhibition. We were, well, I was indebted to the advisory group who helped to develop the exhibition, and Simon and Joe were absolutely key members of that group, and they both were very great contributors to the catalogue as well, and Joe edited the catalogue with me for her sins, I think, yeah, it has been an incredible project to work on, and yeah, I don't think this group of, well, manuscripts and charters will be together again, certainly in our lifetimes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We do have time for questions. Please wait for the microphone.
What is the difference between a charter and a manuscript?
Okay, manuscript literally means written by hand. So charters are manuscript, if you like. But when the objects I were talking about were books, a codices, a codex. Whereas a charter, the ones that Simon was showing you, were on single sheets. So single sheets of parchment. And when we're talking about parchment, we're talking about animal skins. So in Anglo-Saxon England, it's mostly cattle skin, but increasingly also the use of sheep or goat skin as well. If you can get the images back up, can you get the images back up? Yes. And we might be able to sort of point to some things. So one of the interesting things about those charters that we looked at, I don't know if you saw they had sort of lines on them. Yeah, did you see that? That's how they were folded up. So you can reconstruct how they were all folded up. And some of these original charters, so these are things that were written in 838 or 736, were folded up into little squares this big that somehow have survived. And that, I think, is one of the sort of really sort of mind-blowing thing, that these little tiny things that have been folded up and kept over the years, very often in the context of the church that was the beneficiary of the land that was being granted. So a charter is a legal document that records the grant of land or privilege Lots of them survive in copies in codices, manuscripts, but some of them, and we've got quite a lot, survive in those original forms. So they're original legal documents from 1,000 years ago.
And we have quite a lot, but a huge amount has also been lost. And I think that's one of the different things about curating an exhibition on this sort of period compared with something even later in the Middle Ages, let alone a more modern subject, is that the evidence is very fragmentary. I worked on the Magna Carta exhibition at the British Library a few years ago, and my researcher had a spreadsheet with 2,500 possible exhibits on it, and there just aren't that many manuscripts surviving at all from Anglo-Saxon England. So you're choosing from a smaller pool of what survives, but I think one of the interesting things that we've tried to get people to think about in the exhibition is how you use that fragmentary evidence to tell the story of what was actually happening and to get visitors to engage with the difficulties of having to try and extrapolate so much often from very small pieces of evidence that survive.
Yeah, I mean, there's an important sort of point of principle there, which is that medievalists work from data, we work from evidence, but you also have to have a really good imagination to make the leap between the evidence and then to back it up. So we tell good stories because we've got the imagination to do it. But the evidence, the data, is what underpins it all.
Why did so many people sign the charters? Was it to increase the legitimacy of the document or to increase the prestige of the people? Meaning, I was here when this charter was made.
Well, I think the essential point is that these charters are products of the Royal Assembly at which they were produced. And so the witness list is symbolic of that fact, the fact that this is not just the king making an act, it's the king in consultation with and with the permission of the bishops and the earls and the men of the land. So one shouldn't think that they're necessarily all lining up and sort of signing the document itself. It's more of a symbolic representation of a royal act proceeding from a royal assembly. And that's very much a part of the way that the Anglo-Saxons saw it themselves.
So you're right, it is for the, it's really both of those things you say. It's for the prestige of the people as well as ensuring that the record of that transfer of land, because the source of all wealth is land, was then, is now, ever shall be. And that is, so the transfer of land in perpetuity into the church is something that they want to make sure is recorded and witnessed by as many people as possible. So the charter, if you like, is it's a record, not of the well, both of the event as it occurs, a bit like the video record, but it's also picking up other people who agree to it and agreed that this transfer has taken place in the presence of the king.
And I think one of the amazing things about the documents in the exhibition is that I think they do sort of transport you back to that moment in time and to the, you know, when that group of people were there, or with the wills, there's somebody dealing with their property, and gives you a connection with the individuals and the occasion when they were created, which I think is very powerful, and I think people visiting the exhibition have found very, very powerful. Although there is, I think, in curating an exhibition, there is a tension between what is visually appealing to visitors and what is the most historically important. Simon.
Yes.
So Simon, Simon was very keen, very keen to have some charters in the exhibition, which were extremely important, which I deemed to be undisplayable, much to his distress. So, yeah.
I can't tell you what she really said about them. We're not having that on our wall. It might be historically very significant, but it cannot be displayed.
Yeah, has to be something that people are going to stop and look at. Yeah.
Are you trying to tell the story of the English language? And was it possible that the English language could have died out? It was fragile, wasn't it? But when the Normans came, it could have died out. We could have been speaking French. I mean, are you telling a history of the English language?
Yes, certainly it is there as well. I mean, yeah. As Claire said, there are fragments of English, written English, from right at the beginning of the period. So when you first go into the exhibition, there are little runic inscriptions written in English that show the earliest phases of the language. It is revived under King Alfred and is made into a literary language for the church. It clearly existed in the form of epic poetry in a very sort of sophisticated way before that, but it then becomes written down as a language of composition for the church and for thinking and knowledge exchange from Alfred's time onwards, so in the 11th and 12th century. When French starts being used in England after the Norman conquest, it is a language of the elite. So it is a language of government, it's a language of the church, but the language of the vernacular language, the spoken language, remains English to a large degree. You get loan words coming in from French. Those things like beef comes from bœuf, and mutton, mouton, you know, and those are the words of the table, but they're not the words of the spoken people. You know, swine, Schwein from the German. So you can see the language borrowing, but English remains through the conquest. There's a very strong line of continuity in that, the other side of the conquest. So I don't think it is quite as fragile as you might have thought, but that's partly to do with the nature of the regime change that you see in the 11th century, first under Canute and then under William beyond that.
How often do new manuscripts come to light? Say if you were to do this exhibition, have done this exhibition 10 years ago, would it be almost exactly the same as it is now, or are there new things that have been discovered?
So one of the most...
Sorry, yeah. I was going to say the Anderson Pontifical. Yeah.
Okay.
No, you go. No.
I'll do this. So one of the most interesting things, I think, for me is the discovery through the multispectral imaging of Christina Duffy, who is in the audience today, of the Bodmin Gospels. So in the Bodmin Gospels, which are a 9th century Breton gospel book, which ended up in Cornwall, there is a page which looks completely blank, but Christina, who works at the library, did some multispectral imaging on this page for us, and the text of 5 documents, they're manumission documents recording the freeing of slaves in Cornwall. And so this hidden documentary evidence, which had never been seen before, came to light through the new imaging. And this was a manuscript that had been in the National Collection for over 200 years. So sometimes there are new things to be discovered in manuscripts that we already know about. And I think these documents are especially interesting because they are freeing of slaves. So there's information about people who aren't recorded in any other sources at all. But yes, there's also the Anderson Pontifical, which was a spectacular discovery.
Yes, if I can just add that there are every now and then a new Anglo-Saxon manuscript might appear. The best known and well represented in the exhibition is a manuscript known as the Anderson Pontifical, which was discovered in a Scottish hayloft. Someone was just sort of, going through their old ploughshares or whatever, and suddenly they found this stunningly beautiful early 11th century Anglo-Saxon Pontifical, which is a book containing all of the services that a bishop would use. And so there's the coronation order, which is much like the one that survives to this day. That's a complete manuscript. Charters can also come to light, not necessarily in their original form, but in the form of early modern transcripts or whatever. But what we really want is for you lot to devise some kind of machine that enables us to discover manuscripts in the same way that metal detectorists are discovering hoards, gold, silver. We read about it every day almost in the newspapers. Metal detectorists contribute a massive amount. What we want is a machine which can identify Anglo-Saxon
book detector
books just underneath the surface, and then we can dig them up.
Yeah.
So there is a difference.
Yeah. I mean, a complete manuscript was discovered in a bog in Ireland a few years ago, the Fadden Moor Psalter, which came out of that sort of anaerobic environment of the bog, which is a very important new discovery.
Yes. In a bit of a state, but nevertheless.
Alphabet soup is described.
I mean, there were two big exhibitions on this period at the British Museum, which Simon actually contributed to. In 1991, there was the Making of England exhibition, and the subtitle for that was Art and Culture 600 to 900. And in 1984, there was the Golden Age of Anglo-Saxon art, looking at the later Anglo-Saxon period. But I think the focus of those exhibitions was very much more on art and style, whereas the focus of this exhibition is more on the history. And so you can, there were a lot of manuscripts in those other exhibitions which are in this exhibition covering the whole period. But we've got all those loans that are in Britain for the first time, so they weren't included in those exhibitions. And we do have a large number of illuminated manuscripts, but we are, I think, using them to tell a historical story. And the great thing about manuscripts is that they have many pages, so we, in many, many cases, chose to show a different opening, so from the ones that were shown in those exhibitions and are recorded in those catalogues.
I think we could easily fill another hour of this, but we are unfortunately out of time. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you.